Let's have a look at the question. The chart provides information about 5 types of transportation. So we're going to talk about the different types of transportation used by tourists in a particular city. The city is not named between 1989 and 2009. Summarize the information and make comparisons wherever relevant. So this is the kind of questions that you get in your writing task 1. Now, before I start with the writing task 1, few things to keep in mind. For your task 1, in your writing, first of all, let's have the overview of your writing tasks. So you are given 1 hour to attempt 2 writing tasks. There is writing task 1 and there is writing task 2. Your task 2 is your essay writing and task 1 is this report writing. Now, because in task 1, we are supposed to write minimum 150 words and task 2 minimum 250 words, the time division that we do between both of these is 20 minutes and 40 minutes. This is the recommended time, but then again, it depends on individual choice. How good are you at the writing task? You can give more time to task 2 or more time to task 1, depending upon your speed and preference. But, so when we are writing task 1, you are supposed to write at least 150 words. What is the recommended or optimal word limit? That is 180 words. 180 words, or you can write about something 180 to 190 words, but do not exceed 200 words because then it becomes too wordy. And we do not want to make a report too wordy. We want to make it crisp, concise, and give the idea and inference of what is going on in the entire paragraph. So if you can see here, with some of the things that you have to keep here is summarize and make comparisons. So in your task 1, few things. Number 1, summarize. So there's a lot of information given to you, especially if you get a table chart, or sometimes you get 2 table charts or 2 bar charts that you have to write a report on. So in that case, there is a load of information that you're being presented with, but you have to make sure that you summarize this information and then put it into 180 words or the word limit that is given to you. Next, make comparisons. Now see, the data is already there. The data is given to you, right? We know that what was the value of train tourist in 1999. We know what was the value in 2009. We know the values. The data is there. But what we are supposed to do in the report is to make comparisons and make inference from it, right? That how this value differs from this value. What is the change? What values are increasing? What values are decreasing? That is the inference that I call. So if I put it up in a line graph, let's say, yes. So you can see that the value was at peak in 1999. In cars, we can see the highest value was in 2009. For airplanes, it was 1989. So how do we calculate all this information, then summarize and present it? That is where your report writing skills will show. And that is where examiner will assess you, because anybody can go ahead and copy the data from the chart and write it on the paper. But what you're supposed to do is create that inference and analysis in your report. Next, highlight. Now, what do I mean by highlight? Highlight means the main features, right? The highest points. So what is the highest values that you see? The highest value here is in 1989 by a coach. What is the lowest value that you see is airplane. Overall, the airplane value has remained the lowest throughout the years. But what has remained the highest? The coach values. So this is how you make the highlights, right? What are the highest values? What are the lowest values? Last but not the least, group the information. Now, what do I mean by this? That when we're going to write about this, right, there are 5 categories. So how I'm going to split the data into my given structures, what I'm going to write in the overall, what I'm going to write in the body paragraph 1 and then body paragraph 2. So you group the data, you group the similar categories maybe together. For example, the higher categories like car or coach can be grouped together, and then you can go ahead and write about train and airplane, which are the lower categories, in the next body paragraph and combine it with metro. But that is how you group your data. That is completely subjective to your choice. But if you see a pattern forming somewhere, then you can group those 2 things together and the rest of them in the next body paragraph. This will help you summarize the information and make a more clear, emphasized comparison. Because when we group the things together, then we are inherently saying that these 2 things are similar in their pattern. That is how we make comparisons. So let's have a look at the first paragraph for this sample answer. All right. So the paragraph 1 is your simple paraphrase. So what we are supposed to do is we are supposed to paraphrase whatever the question is given to us. Now, in paraphrase, we can add all the details. That is, of course, we'll add whatever is given in the question. But if there's something that is not mentioned in the question, but in the graph itself, for example, the years, or let's say how the data is given, it is mentioned in percentage. That is something that is not mentioned in the question itself. So you can go ahead and write that, or category. So if there are 5 categories, we can mention these categories in our paraphrase. So let's have a look. The first, let's read the question. The question says, the chart provides information. How did we write this? The given column graph depicts. So see how we mentioned, how we changed provides to depicts, chart to given column graph. This is how we change words, use the synonyms and paraphrase so that it doesn't look that we just copied the question and pasted it here. Then, about the 5 types of transportations. Now, how did we write this? The changing trends in popularity of various modes of travel. What was written here? 5 types of tourist use, right? So we talked about the changing trends. This is how we paraphrase the language. Then we mentioned those 5 various modes of travels, which were train, airplane, car, metro, and coach. Among tourists in a specific city over 2 decades, instead of writing just between 1989 to 2009, mention that it was over 2 decades, right? So that is again an inference that you're making. What do you mean by 2 decades? A decade is 10 years. So when we are talking about 2 decades, that means 20 years. So from 1989 to 2009, we are talking about 2 decades. So this is also an important form of vocabulary in your writing task 1. Decades, what is a century? Century is 100. Half a century is 50 years. 2 decades is 20 years. Quarter century, all of these words that you can use in place other ways to describe the time gap between two certain things. All right. So that is your paraphrase. Let's move on to the second body. Now, the second body paragraph is very important. What is the second body paragraph that I'm talking about? It is an overall. What do I mean by an overall? Now, overall will give you the highlights of this particular bar chart. Now, how do I make students understand this? I always tell them to imagine a line graph or even a pie chart. It's an easier way for you to decipher data, right? So in this pie chart, let's have a look at this first pie chart, right? Let me just make it in a better way. So, okay, so what do you see in this pie chart? Okay, first of all, there is, let's say this is the highest value, around 45%. So this is your highest value, that is one highlight. Then there's this lowest value that is around 10%. This is another highlight. And then there are 2 similar values which we're not concerned about. But right now, I'm only talking about the highest and lowest values. That is the highlight of your pie chart. If I'm talking about a line graph, right? So what are the things that we can keep a note here? So we can see that there is a peak here on, let's say, this is year 2005. Then we saw a dip into year 2010. And there is a very fluctuating or stagnant period between, let's say, 2006 to 2009. So these are the overall highlights, right? I'm not talking about the overall data. Okay, its value was this in 2004, its value was this and this, but the overall highlights, the main things that when I look upon this chart, what is the very first thing that I see? So in this particular chart, take a second before reading the sample answer given here and see what are the highlights that you see. All right. So if you can see, there are a few things that you can note here. There is only one trend I can see that is increasing overall. There's a fluctuation, right? This increased and then went down, right? Not a very highlightable trend or not a very good trend that we can talk about in an overall paragraph. This also decreased, but then got up a bit. If we talk about car, it has been increasing overall. But when I talk about metro, it decreased, then increased. For coach, it has been decreasing. So what are the major highlights I can find out here? That for car, it went steadily up. For coach, it went steadily down. All others are presenting a fluctuating trend. And if I talk about the highest values, that are also in the car and the coach in different years, of course, but that is the main highlights of this chart. Now, there's a lot of more data, a lot more things going on here, but when I talk about the overall highlight, this is the major first reference I can make. So that is what we have written. We start this paragraph with overall. It is evident that while the use of car increased over time, as we can see, the coach went down steadily. In comparison, the popularity of train, plane, and metro displayed fluctuating trends during the same period. So this was the different highlighting trends. Now, if you want, you can also talk about that the car showed the highest value. That was around 45%. This was around 47% in year 2009, whereas this coach showed the highest value in 1989. Now, while you're mentioning this, remember not to mention data. All right. In overall paragraph, we never mention data. So this is an important point I wanted you to focus on. In overall paragraph, no data is to be mentioned, just the inference. So I can tell that this was the highest value, but I cannot say what was the highest value was. So I cannot say it was, 35% or 37%. I just made a mistake here. It was supposed to be 35 and 37, right? So you cannot mention the data, but you can mention that the highest value was in this year. That is how you can go ahead with it. So this is how you can write an overall paragraph. Again, this is very subjective to every person. Their inferences might be not as same as yours, but whatever highlights you can see, you can definitely go ahead and put it in your overall body paragraph. Next, body paragraph 1. All right. So see, in this body paragraph 1, let's give it a read and then see how we have grouped these categories together. So we started with 1989. More than 35% of tourists, since we are not sure of the values are not correctly marked. So we'll never be very sure about the values, certain about the values that we are writing in our answer. We can always put an approx, almost, more than, less than in our answer so that we know how the values are fluctuating. It was more popular mode of travel, whereas the aeroplane at around 5%. So what I did was I started talking about 1989 first, and then I mentioned the coach and the airplane. By 1999, the preference of a railway road had risen significantly, with 1/4 of the tourists preferring the train travel. All right. So see, in 1999, I'll just make the comparison side by side so that it's easier for you to understand also. Railway travel, we're talking about the train. So the railway travel in 1999 has risen to about 25%. All right. So here we're talking about the train travel and the coach travel. So we can see the preference for railway travel had risen significantly, with 1/4 of the tourists preferring train travel. So you can see that how it rose from 15% to 25%. And this is where we are talking about that it has increased significantly. And 1/4 means the total percentage is 100. So when I say 1/4, that means 25%. So I hope that is clear. So 1/4 here mentions to the 1/4 part of the 100%. So instead of writing 25%, I went ahead to write 1/4. You can also use quarter. So these are the different ways you can represent data. In comparison, the airway further decreased in popularity to an abysmal, that means a poor 2% in the same year. So airplane decreased. Now we're talking about 1999 in airplane. In the same year, almost the same proportion of tourists, around 23%, used car, metro, and coach. So you can see, instead of writing them differently, when I say car, this is the value. We're talking about 1999. So this is the car value. Let me just clear all my address. Yes, in 1999, that is the same year. We're talking about car, the metro, and coach. So if you see, they all fall pretty much on the same value. So you can club them together and write them in one sentence. Again, this is a very subjective interpretation of the data. If you want to go ahead and separate these values and write it in some other form, this are some other highlights that you see, you can definitely go ahead and do this. But this is a very clear trend that we can see here, that car, metro, coach had the similar values. Next, we have body paragraph 2. So see, Now, how did we categorize this? We started talking about 1989 and 1999 in body paragraph 1, and then we talked about 2009 in this body paragraph. Now, you can divide it by time if you wish, or you can also divide it by categories. That you can talk about the fluctuating categories in one paragraph and then talk about car and coach in the different paragraph. Now, this is completely your choice, but this is how we used to, we wrote our sample answer. So by 2009, the car had become the most widely used vehicle with 35% of tourists traveling by car. This is the highest value that we talked about. Flying, meanwhile, at 3% continued to occupy the position of the least preferred mode of transport. So see, when I talked about the highest in 2009, then I mentioned the lowest. This is how I made the comparison, that there was this high value and there was this one low value in 2000, lowest value. While 15% of the tourists used the coach, 1/5 traveled by train. So 15%, when we talk about coach, here is the 15%, 1/5 traveled by train. So now do we understand what do we mean by 1/5 here? 1/5 of total 100%, right? And what would that be? 1/5 would be 20%. So I hope that is clear. And 1/4 preferred the metro. 1/4 is again your 20 around 25%. So this is the metro. So this is how you can represent your data. Instead of just writing the numbers, you can also use these fractions or multiplies, right? That thrice the people liked. So these are the vocabulary, or these are the things that examiner is looking for in your answer. Now let's have a look at the complete answer. So what is the structure that we followed here? The first, we paraphrase the question. We mentioned all the details that we have talked about, what the data is. You can also mention that the data is given in percentage if you want. Then we mentioned the overall, the highlights that is happening in the chart. Then we had body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2. In body paragraph 1, we talked about 1989, the major features there, and 1999. So see, I have not talked about every category here. I have not talked about what coach was in 1989 and then in 1999. I've only talked about the major categories that I'm concerned with. So this is how we can summarize the data. Then we have 2009 in body paragraph 2. So this is the overall structure. Now, what are the examiners looking for? So there are 4 things to keep a note of. There is task achievement. That means that you have conquered all the parts of the task that was asked to you. So have you summarized the information? Have you compared the data? Have you highlight the main features? These are all the things that you need to be concerned of while you're writing your task 1. So if you achieve all of these 3 categories, then you will score good in task achievement. Next, we have coherence and cohesion, the linkers that you have used. For example, overall, then in comparison, then we have in comparison again, while, meanwhile, all of these words are used to join different sentences and then create a relation between them. So this is how you can use your linkers to create a structure between your answers, and then how you have structure. If your structure of the task 1 is very cohesive, that you're following a particular format, that you have not written overall in between the body paragraphs, but there is a discrete section for each of the things that you have mentioned. And when you're writing the overall, you're also quoting it with overall, or maybe say it is clear from the data in the larger view, or some sort of linker that is telling the examiner that this is the overall of this particular task 1. Then grammatical range and accuracy. Grammatical accuracy means that all your tenses are correct. That if we are talking about the past tense, right? We are talking about something that happened in 1989 and 1999. So you'll be using past tense, but you're using the past tense correctly. If the data was talking about 2025, then you use future tense. But even in the past tense, there are different types of tenses that you can use. You can deploy your perfect tense. You can deploy continuous tense. So are you using all of these? And for your range, are you using different types of sentences? For example, a passive sentence. So a report is usually written in a passive sentences, right? So whenever you write your data, it cannot be an active form, right? It always has to be passive. And there is no doer in the report, that who did this. So we always make sure, for example, the data fluctuated to this value. it wasn't fluctuated by anyone. So that is why we always use passive sentences, that the data showed an increase of value by 2029. Who did it? That is not the concern of it. That is why in a report, we always use passive sentences. Then you can use complex sentences. You can add complex sentences in your particular report. So this is for your grammatical range and accuracy. Last but not the least, lexical resource. So when I talk about lexical resource, what I'm talking about, the words that you use, the specific vocabulary that you use, the synonyms that we use. For example, popularity of various modes of travel. Instead of just saying that what tourists used, then words like increased over time. Then we have, let me just clear all my drawings. Yes. In comparison, fluctuating trends. So what do we mean by fluctuating? That means changing trends. So instead of writing changing, we wrote fluctuating. So that is 1 point for your lexical resource. Next, we have risen. Risen how? Risen significantly. So I talked about the scale of verbs, right? Significantly means with a good amount. Moderately means moderate amount, okayish amount, right? Slightly means a very small amount. For example, 0.1 to 0.2, that is slight change. If we are talking about on a scale of 0.1 to let's say 2 point something, right? For example, let's say our data is between 1 to 100%, right? So if my data is changing from 1 to 2%, that is a slight change. But if my data is changing from 1 to 20%, that is a moderate change. And if my data is changing from 1 to 50%, that is a significant change. And if it goes from 1 to 70, that is an exponential. You can use the word exponential change. So these are different types of verbs. Depending on the intensity of change, you can use them. Then we have further decreased. Abysmal. Abysmal means very low. So abysmal, that means it went to 2%, right? Then we have most widely used vehicle, continue to occupy the position of least preferred mode. So we're just writing was the least preferred mode. It continued, that it was already there, but it still continued to occupy the position of the least preferred mode of transport. So this is how you score in your lexical resource category. Let's move on. Now, few things to keep in mind, since we already talked about for coherence and cohesion, I talked about the linkers. So you can other linkers that you can add in your task one is moreover, however, on the contrary, moreover to add something, however to create contrast, on the contrary to create contrast, although to create contrast, right? We can also use in addition to this, right? We can also add whereas when we're creating comparison, meanwhile, all of these we use meanwhile in our task one report right now. Take care of your spelling and punctuation. It's very important, especially when we are talking about the categories, right? Let's say you're given a country name, Berlin, or some sort of country that you're given. So make sure if you don't know that country or that category specifically, whatever it is in the data, you write the correct spellings of it. It is important. Take care of your grammar. Sentences should be correct. Subject-verb agreement, if any, all of this grammar has to be taken care of. Your punctuation has to be taken care of. Then, cover all requirements of the task, don't leave any points, summarize, compare, highlight, everything. And compare the data. Do not just simply write the data, that it was 23 and then it went to 25. Tell us what happened between 23 to 25. So what happened between 23 to 25? It increased how? Slightly. Tell us that. If it went from 23 to 23 and it was the least, then tell us what happened. It continued to be the same and occupied the least level. So this is tell us how the data changed. That is what I mean by compare the data. That is the inference of the data that the examiner is looking for from you. So these are all the things that you have to keep in mind while you cover your task one. That is all for today. Thank you so much for joining. For more such IELTS interactive sessions and content, please follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to access to our IELTS resources, crash courses, or comprehensive courses, please visit our website, www.yunolearning.com, or give us a call at this number. So that is all for today. If you want anything else to be covered in the next session, please write below in the comments so that we can add it for you in the next sessions that we will have for you. Thank you.